It was April 29th, 1945, and the most feared man in the world was hiding 50 feet underground. Above him, Berlin was burning. Soviet artillery shells were landing every few seconds. The Red Army was less than 1,000 feet away, and Adolf Hitler, the man who had conquered most of Europe, who had sent millions to their deaths, who had promised a 1,000-year Reich, had just 24 hours left to live. This is the story of those final hours. The collapse of a dictator, the end of an empire, and the scramble to understand what was happening in that concrete tomb beneath the Reich Chancellery as everything Hitler had built came crashing down around him. Let me show you how the most destructive regime in human history ended, not with a grand battle, but with a wedding, a suicide pact, and a desperate attempt to rewrite history in the final moments before the end. By late April 1945, the war was essentially over. Germany was surrounded, its cities in ruins, its armies shattered. American and British forces were closing in from the west. Soviet forces were already in Berlin, fighting street by street, building by building, advancing toward the very heart of Nazi power. Hitler had retreated to the Führerbunker, a reinforced concrete shelter beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden in central Berlin. This wasn't some luxurious underground palace. It was a cramped, dimly lit maze of small rooms with low ceilings, poor ventilation, and the constant smell of diesel fuel from the generators. The walls sweated with condensation. The air was stale and thick, and the ground shook constantly from the Soviet bombardment above. The bunker was divided into two levels. The upper level, called the Führerbunker, housed support staff, guards, and some officials. The lower level, the actual Führerbunker, was where Hitler spent his final days. It contained about 18 small rooms, Hitler's personal quarters, a map room where he held his increasingly delusional military conferences, a small conference area, rooms for his closest staff, and not much else. By April 29th, the bunker population had shrunk significantly. Many had fled Berlin while they still could, but a core group remained. Eva Braun, Hitler's longtime companion, had insisted on staying with him. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, was there with his wife Magda and their 6 children. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, remained. A handful of military officers, secretaries, doctors, and SS guards completed the group. These were the witnesses to the end. And as April 29th dawned, if you could even tell it was dawn in that underground tomb, events began to accelerate toward their inevitable conclusion. The day started, as most days in the bunker did, with bad news. Soviet forces had now advanced to within a few hundred meters of the Reich Chancellery. They controlled most of Berlin. There would be no relief force. There would be no miraculous reversal. The military situation was hopeless, and everyone in the bunker knew it. But something else happened on April 29th that devastated Hitler even more than the military collapse. He learned of the fate of his ally, Benito Mussolini. The Italian dictator had been captured by partisans 2 days earlier while trying to flee to Switzerland. On April 28th, Mussolini and his mistress, Clara Petacci, were executed by firing squad. Their bodies were then transported to Milan, where they were hung upside down from meat hooks at a gas station for public display. Crowds gathered to spit on them, to throw rocks, to mutilate the corpses. When Hitler heard this news, according to witnesses, he became obsessed with one thing: ensuring that his own body would never suffer the same fate. He would not be captured. He would not be put on trial. And most importantly, his body would not become a trophy for his enemies. This fear would drive everything that happened in the next 24 hours. Around midday on April 29th, Hitler made a decision that surprised almost everyone in the bunker. He announced that he was going to marry Eva Braun. After more than a decade together, after keeping their relationship largely secret, after years of Eva living in the background while Hitler cultivated his image as a man married only to Germany, he would finally make it official. In the final hours before the end, he would give Eva what she had always wanted, to be Frau Hitler. The problem was finding someone who could legally perform a marriage ceremony. Most officials had fled. The bunker staff scrambled and eventually located a city councilor named Walter Wagner, who was fighting with the Volkssturm, the desperate last-ditch home guard. Wagner was brought to the bunker, still wearing his uniform and steel helmet. The ceremony took place in the map room around midnight between April 29th and April 30th. It was brief and surreal. Hitler and Eva stood before Wagner. The traditional vows were exchanged, but with modifications. The section about pure Aryan descent was included, a grotesque detail even in these final moments. Eva started to sign the marriage certificate with her maiden name, Braun, then crossed it out and wrote, Eva Hitler, born Braun. The witnesses were Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann. After the ceremony, there was a small wedding breakfast in Hitler's private quarters. Champagne was served. For a few hours in that concrete tomb with the Soviet army closing in, they pretended everything was normal. Hitler even reminisced about the old days, the early years of the Nazi movement. Better times. But the celebration was hollow. Everyone knew what was coming. While the wedding was taking place, Hitler had also been working on another document. This was his last will and testament, actually two separate documents, a personal will and a political testament. These would be his final words to history, his attempt to shape how he would be remembered. In his political testament, Hitler did something remarkable. He took absolutely no responsibility for anything. The war wasn't his fault. It was caused by international Jewry. The millions of deaths weren't his responsibility. Germany's destruction wasn't because of his decisions. According to Hitler's final statement, he was the victim. Germany was the victim. And he named his successors. Admiral Karl Dönitz would be the new president, and Goebbels would be chancellor. Interestingly, Hitler officially expelled two men from the Nazi Party in this document, Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler. Göring had tried to assume leadership, believing Hitler was incapacitated. Himmler had been caught attempting to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies. In Hitler's mind, both had committed betrayal, and even in his final hours, he needed to punish that betrayal. His personal will was shorter. He stated his intention to marry Eva Braun and to die with her in Berlin. He gave instructions for the disposal of his personal possessions, including his art collection. And crucially, he gave explicit orders that his and Eva's bodies must be burned to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. These documents were completed in the early morning hours of April 30th. Hitler called in three men, told them to memorize the contents, and ordered them to leave the bunker and ensure copies reached the designated recipients. Against all odds, one of these men, an officer named Wilhelm Johannmeier, actually made it through Soviet lines and delivered his copy. The others were eventually captured, but the documents survived. By the morning of April 30th, everything was in place. The marriage was complete. The will was written. The successors were named. All that remained was the final act. Hitler spent much of April 30th saying goodbye. He moved slowly through the bunker's narrow corridors, shaking hands with staff members, speaking briefly with officers. Witnesses described him as unusually calm, almost relieved. The decision had been made. The burden would soon be lifted. Around noon, Hitler had his last meal. Accounts vary on exactly what he ate. Some sources say it was spaghetti with a simple sauce. Others mention vegetables. What's certain is that it was nothing elaborate. Hitler had been a vegetarian for years and had always eaten simply. Eva joined him, though by this point she was reportedly very anxious, chain-smoking and drinking champagne. After lunch, Hitler gathered the remaining bunker inhabitants in the corridor. It was around 2:30 in the afternoon. He shook hands one final time with everyone present. Goebbels was there with his wife Magda. Several secretaries were crying. Generals stood at attention. The whole scene was surreal, formal goodbyes in a concrete bunker while the battle raged overhead. Then Hitler and Eva retreated to his private study. They closed the door. Hitler's valet, Heinz Linge, and a few others waited outside in the corridor. They had their orders. They knew what was about to happen. Inside the study, the exact sequence of events will never be known with complete certainty because there were no witnesses. But based on the physical evidence found later, we can reconstruct what likely happened. Hitler and Eva sat together on a small couch. They had both obtained cyanide capsules. Hitler, paranoid that the capsules might not work, had previously tested one on his beloved dog Blondie, killing the animal to ensure the poison was effective. Eva took her capsule. She bit down on it and died quickly from cyanide poisoning. Hitler, not trusting the poison alone, used his Walter pistol. He shot himself in the right temple. The gunshot was muffled by the thick concrete walls, But those waiting outside heard it. One single shot, and then silence. Lingo waited a few moments, then opened the door. Hitler was slumped on the couch, a bullet hole in his temple, blood dripping onto the carpet. Eva was beside him, unmarked, the smell of bitter almonds from the cyanide in the air. The most destructive leader in modern history was dead. The time was approximately 3:30 in the afternoon on April 30th, 1945. Hitler was 56 years old. He had been in power for 12 years and 3 months. In that time, he had started a war that killed more than 60 million people, orchestrated the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others in the Holocaust, and reduced much of Europe to rubble. And now he was gone. But his final orders remained to be carried out. Linga and several SS men wrapped both bodies in blankets and carried them up the stairs to the emergency exit that led to the Reich Chancellery Garden. This was dangerous. Soviet forces were close enough that they were taking sporadic sniper fire. Artillery shells were still landing nearby. They placed both bodies in a shallow crater caused by an earlier shell explosion. They doused the bodies with gasoline, more than 40 gallons of it. Goebbels, Bormann, and a few others stood at the bunker entrance watching. Someone struck a match and threw it. The bodies ignited. The cremation was hasty and incomplete. They didn't have time for a proper burning. The Soviets were too close. After a while, they gave up, shoveled some dirt over the partially burned remains, and retreated back into the bunker. Hitler's fear of ending up like Mussolini had been addressed, but barely. His body was not intact, but it wasn't completely destroyed either. As for what happened next, the bunker began to empty. Goebbels, true to his word, had his 6 children poisoned with cyanide that evening. He and his wife Magda then went up to the garden and had an SS guard shoot them. Martin Bormann attempted to escape through the Soviet lines and disappeared. He was later confirmed to have died, though exactly when and how remained unclear for decades. Many others in the bunker tried to break out. Some succeeded. Some were captured. Some were killed. The Soviet forces discovered the bunker on May 2nd, just 2 days after Hitler's death. They found the bodies of Goebbels and his family. They searched for Hitler's remains. Eventually, Soviet troops found partially burned bodies in the garden. They conducted autopsies and concluded that one was Hitler based on dental records. The Soviets then did something strange. They kept this discovery secret for weeks, allowing rumors and conspiracy theories to flourish. Some of this was deliberate disinformation. Stalin himself reportedly enjoyed the confusion, at one point suggesting to Western leaders that Hitler had escaped to Spain or Argentina. The Soviets eventually moved Hitler's remains several times before finally, in 1970, crushing what remained into powder and scattering it in a river. They wanted to ensure there would be no grave, no shrine, no place for neo-Nazis to gather. In death, as in his final hours, Hitler's body was denied the dignity he so desperately wanted to preserve. So what do we make of these final 24 hours? What do they tell us about Hitler and the regime he built? First, they reveal the absolute delusion that gripped the Nazi leadership until the very end. Even as the Red Army was literally blocks away, Hitler was still issuing military orders to armies that no longer existed, moving pins on maps representing divisions that had been destroyed weeks ago. He lived in a fantasy world where willpower alone could reverse reality. Second, they show the narcissism at the core of Hitler's character. His final testament blamed everyone but himself. The Jews started the war. His generals betrayed him. The German people failed him. Right up until his final hours, he could not accept responsibility for the catastrophe he had created. Third, they demonstrate the bizarre mixture of the mundane and the monstrous that characterized the Nazi regime. A wedding ceremony with champagne in a bunker. Goodbye handshakes before a double suicide. These normal human rituals twisted and corrupted by the circumstances. And finally, they reveal Hitler's ultimate cowardice. He had sent millions to their deaths. He had ordered his soldiers to fight to the last man. He had demanded that German civilians sacrifice everything for final victory. But when the end came for him personally, he chose suicide. He chose escape. He denied his enemies the satisfaction of capturing him, but he also denied justice to his victims. The man who had claimed to be the savior of Germany, who had promised glory and greatness, ended his life in a hole in the ground, married for less than a day, with his capital in flames and his nation in ruins. The Thousand-Year Reich lasted 12 years, and its architect spent his final hours in a concrete tomb, unable to face the consequences of what he had done. Today, the site of the Führerbunker is unmarked. After the war, the Soviets demolished what remained of the Reich Chancellery. The bunker itself was partially destroyed and filled in. In the 1980s, the East German government sealed it completely. Today, it lies beneath a parking lot and some apartment buildings in central Berlin. There's a small information board nearby, but nothing else. No monument, no marker, nothing. This anonymity is intentional. Germany has worked hard to ensure that the location does not become a pilgrimage site for extremists. The man who wanted to be remembered for 1,000 years has been deliberately forgotten, his final resting place erased from the landscape. But while the physical location has been erased, the lessons from those final 24 hours remain. They remind us of where unchecked power leads. They show us what happens when individuals are willing to follow a leader without question. They demonstrate that even the most powerful tyranny can collapse completely, and they force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The man in that bunker, the man who caused so much suffering, was still human. He wasn't a monster from another planet. He was a person who made choices, terrible choices, and those choices led to unimaginable consequences. Understanding that doesn't excuse anything he did, but it does remind us that the capacity for such evil exists within human nature, and that vigilance against it must be constant. In the end, Hitler's last 24 hours were not the dramatic finale he might have wanted. There was no glorious last stand, no heroic sacrifice, just a rushed wedding, hastily written documents, and a gunshot in a room underground. The regime that promised eternal glory ended in flame and rubble. And the man who started the deadliest war in human history spent his final hours hiding in the dark, having achieved nothing but destruction. The bunker is gone. The Reich is gone. But the lessons from those final hours must never be forgotten.